our next round of conversations with art historians. Here we, the students of Institute of Global and Historical Studies at the Government College University Lahore, invite senior scholars to discuss their ideas and works. Our guest scholar for today's conversation and discussion is Professor Amelia Jones, and we will be in a conversation with her on her recent publication, which is her book, In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, which was published in 2020. So before we start, let me introduce Professor Amelia. Professor Amelia Jones is the Robert A. Day Professor and Vice Dean of Academics and Research at the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California. She is a renowned theorist, a historian of art and performance studies. Her scholarships offer a broad and alternative views of gender, identity, and performance studies in the 21st century. So in today's discussion, we will be discussing Professor Amelia's book, which is A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance. And for the ease of the audience, let me give a quick summary of the book. So the volume explores the interconnected concepts of queer and gender performance or performativity over several decades. It provides both a comprehensive historical account and a critical examination of these ideas, interrogating their foundational assumptions. The book examines cultural forms spanning from 1960s to 70s sociology, performance art, drag queen balls, contemporary queer voguing performances by Pacifica and Maori people in New Zealand. It investigates why and how the concepts of queer and performativity are so frequently linked in discussions about identity, popular gender displays, and performance art. Was that okay? Would you like to add on to the summary of the book by yourself, Amelia?
No, that's fine. I'm sure the details will come out as we talk.
Sure. Okay, we welcome you to the panel discussion, and I'm so excited for this. Thank you for taking the time out to join us today, and it's an honor to have you over here with us. So before I open the floor for discussion, let me introduce all the panel members. We have Aisha Amanullah and Mohammed Ahmed, who are undergrad students in their final year for art history, and Ali Faisal, who is an MPhil student of art history. Welcome to the discussion, Professor. So I think I will start with the first question. My first question is that you emphasize on genealogy over history. How does this shift change in how we think about performances?
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here too. So let me just jump in. I think the reason that genealogy is so helpful is that it shifts the focus away from a traditional idea of history as a kind of neutral process of just finding the truth in the past. So what Foucault is giving us is a model where we're aware of the role of the historian in performing the history. So I think of genealogy as quite coextensive with that history where meaning becomes performed rather than pre-existing truth. And actually, it's great that you asked that question because I didn't think of really elaborating that. But when I saw the question, I thought about it and I realized that actually I just instinctively understood that genealogy is itself part of that rise of the concept of the performative. So it's a performative way of understanding history that is not a singular truth, but rather a constellation of discursive moments that the writer is crafting into a narrative. So it was very important to me that I not claim to be presenting the only history of these terms, rather than it's just one way of thinking about it.
I see. That's wonderful. So Aisha, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, sure. We are really glad to have you here, Amelia. I just want to ask that as the book employs a Foucauldian genealogical method, so how do you see this approach allowing more flexibility or perhaps even resistance compared to traditional historiography when tracing queer performance practices?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already kind of answered that, that it's more compatible with the ethos of how I'm understanding the coming together of kind of queer politics and ideas about performance, that
Mhm.
it was elaborated actually out of Nietzsche's work by Foucault at the same time as these other concepts are being elaborated. So I
Mhm.
think it works really well as a method that enhances rather than kind of tries to pin down those other concepts. So again, I would say that it does allow for flexibility, but also resistance in the sense that you're refusing a singular history, which itself could be argued to be,
Mhm.
performative or a
Yeah.
queering history, etc.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, Ali Faisal, do you have any question to ask?
Uh, yeah, I do have. Hello, Professor Amelia. In critiquing the canon of performance studies and art history, you reframe certain artists and performances. How do you decide which performance to include, or figures to include or exclude from this genealogy?
Yeah, well, the beauty of genealogy is, I'm not sure Foucault says this, but it really exposes the perspective that you're working from. And so, without question, my choices are very specific to me. um,
Mhm.
and the point is to acknowledge that I can only write with some authority, as it were, about the performance histories that I was kind of trained in. I
Mhm.
can't write about other national ways of thinking about time-based, body-oriented works because I didn't live anywhere. Well, I didn't live outside of the West.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
yeah, so um, I decided which performances to include, and this is important for me, and it has been since I wrote my book Body Art in 1998, that I believe that artworks and performances do their own theorizing. And so it
Mhm.
was very important to me that the artworks that I have learned from in basically I self-trained in performance studies. So that's another thing to mention is that I decided I wanted to understand this discipline and be able to mobilize it in my work. And so I did all the reading, and the readings that I did were very normative. And at a certain point, I wanted to kind of stand outside of that and critique it. And that's also what the book is. But the performances I chose are the ones that I feel were theorizing something in parallel to, or sometimes even in advance of, the philosophies or the performance theory. And again, they're very partial because of the ones I know, having trained originally as an art historian and having originally in the 1990s, my goal was to put performance and body art back into art history because they had been completely left out. So, taking even an artist like, not in the book, but this is just another example, that Robert Morris, who was
Mhm.
talked about constantly as a genius who made minimalist works, but it was never mentioned that he did performances until I think there was a big Guggenheim show in the 1990s that did actually at least present those works, but it wasn't incorporated into one's understanding of what artists were doing. So that was something very early on that I started to do. And with this book, it was more about looking back all the way to the 50s and thinking about artists who were putting art into motion over time, often involving embodied experiences. And those artists, in my view, are starting to theorize the same things that the sociologists and the philosophers and the other thinkers are doing. So that's basically how I chose which works, is they kind of came to me as examples that I knew of, having studied originally art history and later performance. And as you know, by the end of the book, it's all much more personal and embodied, because they're performances that I've watched and in some cases participated in, or even programmed as part of events. So it gets more and more personal as you get towards the contemporary period, where I myself am part of this world of performance, and I'm sometimes or often in the room with the performers.
And you've also mentioned that you stumbled across your father's work and he was a social psychologist. How was that like? Could you like to tell us about it for a few minutes?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny how as you get older, you become more aware of all the things that formed you as a child and as a young person. And so when I realized that my fixation on this fascinating idea of, for example, relationality, or the way that two people in a social space relate with each other, which is a key part of what performance is doing. And I had to realize at some point that my father was literally doing work on that area of social psychology. Interpersonal perception was one of the words they used. I'm a little more drawn to the sociology terms, such as, social performance with Irving Goffman, or relation of two people. But nonetheless, I realized how much my interest in that was probably conditioned by growing up with someone who sometimes brought these conversations to the dinner table. And I say in the book, my father died a long time ago in the early 90s. So I asked my mother if she ever heard him talk about Irving Goffman, and she said, "Oh, of course, And so that was like, oh my God, I'm literally like just, continuing my father's work. And that's also about making clear that I realize my own genealogy is part of the book, that I can't escape these things that formed me when I'm thinking about what that history is, or what artists to me are interesting and provocative within that history. And as you know, my father's grandparents were all missionaries in India, near Madurai, so I have a South Asian connection that is very colonialist, that has to do with that part of my family engaging in that way. Now, what does that have to do with performance? Nothing on the surface of it, but it has a lot to do with my relationship to the world and with my privilege. The fact that I've inherited a kind of missionism, which teaching is also a kind of missionism. I hope it's not quite as ideologically fraught. And I just had to realize these things about my own partiality that relate to my own family history, which are there for all of us. And if we don't acknowledge them, then we can be unaware in the ways that we look at history, or the ways that we write theoretical models.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, thank you so much. Also, we have Mohammed Ahmed next. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, sure. Hello, professors. My question is, if we have to expand this genealogy today, would there be any key areas or intersections you feel need more attention, such as disability, global south, or digital performance?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the book is right just as it is, because it was written when it was written. and
Mm-hmm.
I'm very clear that I couldn't write about the global South other than technically New Zealand is part of the Southern Hemisphere. I could only write about the places where I was living for long enough that I have some understanding, albeit very limited in the case of New Zealand. So I think, again, it goes back to the fact that every person has access to different forms of performance, to different histories, to different ideas of non-normative sex, gender embodiments. And you can only write with any kind of depth about things that you have personally had access to or experienced. What I do hope is that my book is useful for people writing about disability, for people writing from the global South perspective and building on that, or maybe disagreeing with certain parts of it and saying like, well, this is interesting, but it doesn't apply at all if you're looking at Pakistan. That would be important because I can't speak to that, right? So other people, I hope, will speak to that and build on it.
Okay, would you ever like to visit the South Asia and see how queer and identifying as queer and performativity is over here?
I would love to visit Pakistan and India.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, I have family connections
Yeah.
to South India.
Hmm.
I also have beloved friends. In particular, I'm thinking of Alpesh Patel, who is obviously Indian American, who writes about queer sexualities in the
Hmm.
kind of India, England, US
Hmm.
diasporic situation. So, yeah, I've learned a lot from my friends who are studying that. Gayatri Gopinath, people doing really important work.
Yeah.
And I would love to visit someday. I also do Iyengar yoga,
Mm-hmm.
which is based, the original institute is in Pune. So that would be another reason to go to India.
Okay, we would love to have you here, or even if you go to India, we still would be very interested in your work and whatever interpretations you come up with, because I think it would be very interesting because the queerness and the performativity in West is like a totally different concept to what it is in South Asia or Pakistan or India, places as such. So yeah, it would be a very interesting interpretation from you.
Yeah, I would love
Okay,
that.
okay, Aisha, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, as you guys are discussing, so I just want to ask that despite all the wonderful aspects of the book you have mentioned, some of the examples discussed in the book might limit its applicability to understanding queer performances in non-Western contexts. Do you see possibilities for applying queer genealogies in non-Western performance traditions, where cultural and historical contexts differ significantly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would just be an extension of my previous answer that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
reason that I changed the book when I went to live in New Zealand was precisely
Mhm.
because, well, let me go backwards.
Okay.
The originally came out of my awareness when I moved to England as an American of the
Mhm.
narrowness of queer theory as it existed
Mhm.
around the early 2000s. And the
Mhm.
narrowness, as I say in the book, it really is an entirely United States, mostly even urban United States, mostly Berkeley and New York, United States. I mean, it's like actually
Mhm.
particular group of people who are almost all white who were writing queer theory in the 90s. And, when you move to another country, you can see these things very clearly. Um,
Yeah.
and so that's when I initially, a long time ago, got the idea of the book of kind of, well, someone needs to write about this dominant strand of queer theory and how limited it is, and what happens if you put pressure on it from even from another white dominant English speaking country like England or Canada, where I also lived, and then going to New Zealand, which is also a Commonwealth country, but has a very strong Maori and Pacifica population that have a lot of cultural visibility, especially in creative arts and performance. So that was my argument for the Fulbright Award, and I got the award and I went to live there, and I was only there for 6 months. I do have a partner. My husband is actually from New Zealand, so you get another kind of insider view.
Yeah.
What was interesting to me is how destabilized I felt when I was trying to understand New Zealand, but especially the Pacifica and Maori performance communities. And instead of deciding, well, I feel destabilized and I'm just not going to write about that, I decided that my feeling destabilized was part of what I was trying to understand about what queer can mean. And that goes to really Eve Sedgwick's idea of queer as something that is destabilizing to a norm. And so I decided that the book would open itself up more and more towards the end to that destabilization. And so it's only one example of an infinite number of non-Western cultures you could bring in, but it's one that I had access to because I was living there. And obviously the Maori and Pacifica traditions and histories are connected to the West in a very dramatic and visible way. We know exactly when the English ships got there. We know exactly what happened. And one of the reasons the Maori are so powerful is that they rode on the ships with the English sailors to Australia and saw how horrible it was what the English were doing in Australia. And so they said, no, that's not going to happen here. So there's a power there in spite of the discrimination and oppression they have also experienced. There's a power. And so when they, really by the mid to late 90s, Maori and Pacifica artists and intellectuals were reading queer theory and watching movies like Paris is Burning, which is about the voguing community. And they were making decisions to appropriate that to their own ends. And I can't fully understand like how much of it is them and how much of it is the Western, but that's part of the point I'm making is at this point, you can't fully decolonize a performance practice like that, because you can't tease out what part of it is somehow original to a Maori worldview, because the Maori are Westernized and are constantly interacting with those traditions. So I guess it provided a way also to try to understand where I am in relation to the complexities of the world now and how impossible it is to distill any kind of culture, whether it's American culture or English culture or Maori culture. You can't really pull them apart, because one of the really fascinating kinds of research I looked at were people like Lee Wallace, who argues that you can't take Englishness out of, Pacifica, but you also can't take Pacifica out of Englishness, because when the English so-called discovered the Pacific Islands, that was the moment where Europeans defined sexuality as such. And she argues that it is through those encounters that their own ideas of sex and gender became denaturalized. And so they started feeling like they needed to define this thing called homosexuality, which is, again, also Foucault, who points out that that wasn't even a term until the very moment of the encounters in the Pacific, is Lee Wallace's point. So around the late 18th century. So that also helps us denaturalize just the idea of queer that is so Western.
Okay, on to you, Ali Faisal.
Thank you, Emma. Professor, much of the queer theory has been criticized for being overly academic. How do you, and disconnected, of course, disconnected from the lived queer experience? How do you, how do you
Balance.
balance? Yeah, of course. How do you balance this scholarly rigor with effective, often visceral qualities of performance, queer performance art?
Well, that's a great question. And it's easy to answer because the way that I structure the book is with scholarly, I hope, rigorous sections that are punctuated by these very personal, very embodied descriptions of my experiences of performances. So I'm trying to make it very personal in the sense that we can only honor what queer performance does if we look at how it's affecting us as embodied individuals in the room with these bodies, or even through documentation if we're talking about historical performance. So that's why I structured the book that way, is precisely to honor the as you say, the affective, visceral qualities of queer performance, because those qualities only operate in relation to other people in the room. So if I'm the other person in the room, then I need to sit with those experiences, that part of the experience. And that in itself, I hope, is a convincing queer method.
Yes. Okay, on to you, Mohammed Ahmed. Do you have any question that you would like to ask?
Yes, yes, I have. Okay, Professor, my question is, how does the book engage with the idea of archives and ephemerality in documenting and analyzing the performances?
Yeah, I don't think it deals with that directly. So I've done a lot of work, obviously, on the problem of live performance, which has a beginning and an end, and then it's over, and then how does it become historically understood? But this book doesn't really stay in that place. I think it's pretty clear. I make it very clear which performances I was personally attending and which I was not. And I include images in some cases, not just in this book, but other essays I've written recently, where you can, the performance document actually includes me. So that's one way of like, oh, that's weird. Like I'm now part of the document. And that again reinforces this idea that the intensity of performance is experienced relationally. And then it goes back to my chapter on relationality, that if we're thinking of live performance as potentially having a viscerality, then we're thinking of that in relation to spectators in the room, not if the person's in the room by themselves doing the thing. You know, it's the old philosophical question, are they really, is it really happening? Of course it's happening, but in terms of that, those qualifiers like visceral or affective or intense, that only happens with other people in the room. Those are aspects of performance where it comes to mean something relative to other people. But that can happen through documentation. So I've always argued that there's nothing inherently more authentic about being in the room. It's just different. So if you view, for example, when I first saw the black and white photographs documenting Ulay and Abramovich doing their relation works, you know, I was very moved by those. The photographs are really, they're well taken. And of course, they're chosen out of a number of photographs as kind of iconic. And so that can also be very affective and moving in a bodily way. It doesn't have to be live, but if it's live, it's obviously ontologically different. It's moving in a different way.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Okay, Aisha, on to you.
Yeah, sure. Professor, I guess you draw on Jos Esteban Munoz's concept of queer utopia. Do you actually believe queer performance today still carries utopian potential, or has it become more about critique and survival within new liberal frameworks? What do you say?
That's an excellent question. I think it's both, and I think it always has been both. So I think one thing people like me have learned with the rise of fascism in my country is how much the pre-existing system served people like me, but not other people. In other words, radical queers, especially radical queers of color, especially radical queers of color who come from migrant backgrounds or precarious backgrounds, have always had to survive within a system that really was not hospitable to them. So neoliberal systems, which I was always critical of, but at the same time, they didn't endanger me because I'm a white middle-class person. I can pass as heteronormative, even though many of my allies are queer and trans. So I'm not endangered by that system. So for people like me, the current situation is horrifying and very destabilizing. And most of my queer performance friends are upset, but they're not surprised. You know, for them, this is just an extension of how they felt under the kind of normative white middle class neoliberal regimes before. So I think that the works I love the most that are going on today have definitely utopian potential. They point to something possible, but they also, without question, the performance itself, but also within the community that's supporting that performance and that's always expanding by watching and engaging with those performances, that is also a mode of surviving and thriving by building community. So both of those things, I think, happen.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask the next question now. So, some critics argue that the book's emphasis on queer, like one single fixed identity, can lead to a very narrow, oversimplified view on what it means to be queer, which can potentially overlook the actual complexities and experiences that people really go through. So, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that drew me to the queer community and to queer performance in the first place was that, but I mean, you can't really fix what it is. And I hope my book doesn't seem like it's doing that because I don't think you can. So you can only engage with it as where you're situated and either resist it or allow it to change your own idea of who you are. Not just in terms of sex, gender, but all the aspects of how you occupy the social world, right? So one of the things I do talk about in the book is the tendency within this North American white dominant idea of queer or queer theory, that it's very common that queer gets conflated with lesbian and gay. Very common. And for me, it's been interesting to see how that affects me as an ally of that community, and I hope a part of it, that there are times when I am excluded because I'm not perceived to have same-sex object choice, you know? And on the one hand, that's absolutely their prerogative not to want me there. But on the other hand, it's very telling that that's still kind of an instinct, is to reduce queer to a kind of cis gay lesbian idea. But also, and this I'm building on Eve Sedgwick again, it's also true that I don't know what some of their experience is, because I'm not persecuted on the basis of my perceived sexual object choice. So I also really understand that, so you can't fully get rid of the essentialism, because in some ways the violence does occur in relation to essentialized categories. But I guess I would say you have to keep that intention with the undecidability of queer, and you have to question when queer gets connected too firmly to the idea of sexual object choice, because then it's not really queer, then it's gay and lesbian, and it tends to be more cis. And then you're excluding trans people, gender nonconforming people. And so I think it's just an ongoing conversation, and sometimes groups need to be more essentializing in the moment for political reasons, and other times they can be more porous, and more queer can be more, I think, de-essentialized and mobile.
Yeah, totally. That was a very good explanation. I loved your answer. Aisha, do you have any question that you want to ask?
Yeah, just one more. In your discussion of embodiment, you basically argue that the body is not only performed but also culturally coded. How does this view challenge or complicate existing theories of performativity, like those of Judith Butler?
Yeah, this was the only question in looking at these briefly in advance that I wasn't sure about, because I think her whole argument, especially since the book Bodies That Matter in 1993, is that they are cultural, like it is culturally coded. That's how gender takes place, right? Through cultural coding. So I think actually I'm building on Judith Butler there. I'm not in any way at odds with her. I think where I pushed back a little bit with Butler is in the, especially in the early work, which is kind of unfair because obviously it was over 35 years ago, but in Gender Trouble, and she's aware of this, right? That the way that she defined gender performance, because she doesn't really use the word queer, was very easily appropriated and oversimplified. And that's one of the problems with the genealogy I'm looking at, is the way that it got so oversimplified, it got channeled into mass culture like RuPaul's Drag Race. And, you know, this idea that you have full choice and free will and agency in just deciding what your gender will be. And the reason she wrote Bodies That Matter, which I love, I think it's a much more important book, for me at least, than Gender Trouble, because she's arguing with those people who are overly simplifying it and saying, no, you can't just choose what to do. Like, that's not how agency works. It's much more complicated. And so whatever we think we're choosing to do is already culturally constructed and coded in advance. So on the other hand, she gets herself into a corner. She has nowhere to go, because then that implies that we have no agency at all. And that's obviously not quite right either. So I think because of the nature of her being a philosopher who wrote her first book on Hegel, she does get herself into this binary a lot in a way that someone like Eve Sedgwick as a literary theorist doesn't. But I also think a lot of those arguments in that early days of queer theory in the 1990s were obviously excluding entirely other worldviews. So to go back to one of your earlier questions, I was very, very lucky with this book to be in dialogue with Tavia Nyong'o and with Josh Chambers-Letson. And they both really pushed me hard on this idea that this is the only genealogy. And, you know, as I said to you, it's obviously not the only one. It's the one that, as myself as a scholar, seemed very dominant. But Tavia, in his beautiful book, Afrofabulations, and in other books by him, has kind of effectively argued for an alternative genealogy that is entirely kind of Black American. So Samuel Delaney rather than, you know, Esther Newton in the 1960s. Samuel Delaney is this far out Black science fiction writer and theorist. And he actually started thinking about queer in the late 60s. And so it's really interesting when you look at different models or different people who are positioned differently within American culture. So Tavia's family is, I believe they're Kenyan. And so he's not exactly African American in the usual sense either. So he's able to bring like a totally different embodied experience to thinking about where this conjunction of queer and performance come from. So to go back to your question, yes, it's culturally coded. And I do think that's something that is very deeply in Judith Butler's work, especially Bodies That Matter.
Thank you. Thank you. You really explained it really well. Thank you.
I was very interested in that question myself because I wanted to see how you build your analysis and diverge from her early formulations, Judith Butler's, especially considering the critiques you raise on regarding agency. So I was very interested in that myself. Also, a follow-up question that I want to ask. Cedric's work on queer performativity and shame seems very significant. How does her emphasis on affect contribute to your understanding of the relationship between queerness and performativity?
Yeah.
If you would like to elaborate like for a few seconds on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely kind of honor Eve Sedgwick in the book as someone who, for me, her work performed performativity. In other words, itself is performative. And I think it because of that enactment of kind of doing what she's saying, it really helped me understand how J.L. Austin, like this weird English language philosopher, how that arcane idea actually could really be mobilized in a very exciting way. So I would say that it was Sedgwick's work in the 80s, but especially the 1990s, where as a literary theorist, she's able to perform the idea of performativity in a way that really is exciting and that puts meaning in motion in a way that to me is more useful in some ways, but there's no question that we're all indebted to Judith Butler as well, because the gender performance idea is really also quite mobilizing.
Okay, moving on to some of the final questions, because I will be asking some follow-up questions. I'm not letting this chance go. So how do you envision the future of queer performances and queer performance studies, and what theoretical or methodological shifts do you hope to see in the future?
I mean, going back to some of your earlier questions, putting pressure on my limitations, I really hope to see people from other parts of the world from other cultures where maybe the word queer doesn't work, you know, because it's a problem to have these two English words that get applied to completely other cultures. And one of the things I talk about in the book is when I was in New Zealand and going to queer performances by Maori and Pacifica people, and there was a workshop I went to, and I kind of bumbled around and said something like, well, you know, do you even read American queer theory? And they were like, I mean, of course, you know. And I thought, God, that it's like great, because then we have a global conversation, but it's also, yeah, there needs to be people taking that and doing something different or putting it partly aside. And again, we can't completely pretend like we don't know about it, because we do. Like if you've watched Paris is Burning and if you've read Judith Butler, it would be silly to say, oh, I don't know anything about that. But I would love to see younger scholars and artists and performers to really put pressure on the limitations and to find maybe other models for thinking about non-normative gendered sexualities. So one of the problems, I did some reading in New Zealand about, like, before the English got there, they had concepts of people who were born, let's say, with male anatomy, but who were treated like females. And each Pacific island has its own word for that. And it's slightly different culturally depending on which island. So in Samoa, it's called fa'afafine. And that kind of dovetailed with their understanding of voguing culture through American culture. And so now the fa'afafine are kind of drag queens. There's like a whole, so like that's a great example of going inside of the American thing, but actually just using it for your own ends, you know. And I would love to see more of that, because the American money, American culture, American ideas about the world should stop dominating the world. Like, let's just say. I think it's time.
Okay. As I say. Also, you conclude by suggesting that the importance of being in between subjects to listen, learn, relinquish preconceived notions. What are some concrete ways that scholars and artists can embody this in between position in their works?
Thank you for bringing that up. It's my favorite idea in the book, really, because in the end, that's, you know, we can see politically today how important that is. So when you have violent political systems that are posing people against each other, the most radical thing you can do is insist on being relational and in community. So as scholars, I think we have to recognize what the limitations of universities, which are also being attacked today in the United States, and we have to form community in a way with our students so that we're not, you know, somehow giving them knowledge, but actually working with them to move forward. So that's what I try to do. And I feel very lucky that I'm teaching in an art school, because it's much more conducive to that than humanities. The way art history is set up as a discipline makes that very difficult. And I was in art history departments for 20 years, and I was always kind of chafing, and it just didn't feel right. But in an art school, it's much more collaborative. The students are much more open-minded in some ways. They also don't read, so you know, you have to like bring them into the reading and encourage them to want to read. So maybe that's an example. And with scholarship, again, the further along I get, the more in community I think my work is, so that my next book is partly about the neoliberalization of culture and society, especially universities and the art world, but then it's also about how artists and intellectuals have found ways to live creatively against the grain of that very oppressive capitalist neoliberal model in this country primarily. So I'm really interested in that. I think those people give me models for how to do it, right?
See, I'm very excited for your next book. I would love to read it and read it again and again. And also, I thought the concept of not reading and being an art student was just over here, but
No,
I guess it's universal.
yeah. I mean, I joke with them that I know you're here because you didn't want to do any reading, but you know, because you think you're just a visual artist. But if you don't read, you don't know all the things that have been said and all the things artists have said and other people have done that relate to what you're doing. So you're acceding your power by not reading. And also with the battle that we have with AI in the classroom, I have to say, I refuse to police them, but I tell them it's your decision. If you want to accede your voice to a robot, it sounds like a bad idea to me, but you know, and then when you read what they write, you can tell completely if they're using Chat GPT because it's awful. It's like this bland, it's not the person's voice at all. It's a summation of everything everyone else has said. So they have to make that decision. I mean,
You're right. Definitely. Definitely. Well, I can like go on and on with the questions because I'm having so much fun in this conversation, but we have to come to an end. And it was wonderful talking to you and listening to you, and all the answers that you gave were so insightful, and I had so much fun. Thank you so much. So with this, I thank you on behalf of the Institution of Global and Historical Studies for your time and interest in our activity. It was absolutely great experience to have you as our guest today. And we certainly look forward to having you again very soon for the upcoming book that you're going to be having. And I'm very excited for that.
well, thank you for having me. It's been great. I appreciate your excellent questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it was all based off of your book. So thank you. Okay, thank you.